Okay, so for this little tutorial, we are going to work on leaderboards and how to keep track of our top scores for our game. And in order to do that, we're going to have to start by actually making a game. So what I've done is I've just started a empty 2D project in Unity, and we're going to add in some stuff to it and then work on saving our high scores. So essentially what we're going to do is just make a game where we click, and we'll just hit the spacebar as many times as we can, and then we'll keep track of that. We'll give ourselves like 10 seconds or something like that, and then keep track of the high score at the end. So we're going to build a lot of this in the canvas. And I may go kind of quickly through building the UI part of this because it's all in other tutorials that are on my YouTube channel. But as far as the main point of this is how are we going to save our high scores and get them back when we restart our game. So let's just go ahead and create a canvas, UI, text. That's going to build us a canvas where we're going to draw all of our text on the screen. There isn't going to be any graphics in this game. It's just going to be text only. And let's see. So with our canvas, we need to change the way that we're actually drawing this thing. Over here with render mode, we have 3 different options. And I think in a different video I go through them in more detail. But for this one, we're just going to go to screen space camera, which means this is going to be on top of one of our cameras in our scene. And in this scene, we only have one camera to choose from anyways. But so once you set your screen space to camera, you have to select which camera you're going to use. So we'll use this main camera. I'll just drag it in here and set it. And the other thing I'm going to do is change the UI scale mode to scale with screen size. That way, if we're on different resolutions or we're letting the end user scale things, everything will scale very nicely. So once we have those 2 things set up, it makes it a lot easier to add our text. Our text is actually way down here, so I'm going to click and just drag it up. We'll add a couple things here. The first one is going to be just keep track of how many times we're clicking. But before I get too far, I hate this default blue color, and so we're just going to change that to a white. And if we look on our game tab, we have our new text up here. And this will be, we'll call it, I don't know, total clicks. So if I go to our text, and I'm going to change it, and it's going to be total clicks. We'll just start it at 0. And then we'll build our little script here, which is going to be called the game controller. And we need to put that onto an empty game object, which I will rename game controller. And I'll drag the script over to it. Now I'm going to open this thing up so that we can begin to actually just put some code to this. And it's going to be really simple. This isn't a game that is going to be great by any stretch of the imagination, but it should be good enough to show our high scores. So the one thing that we need to do, since we're using UI, we're going to need to change the text on the screen. We need to import our Unity engine.ui. And we're going to have, for right now, we're just putting in the code to count how many clicks somebody can get in a 10-second span. So, and then after that, we'll put in the actual leaderboard stuff. So we need to have a reference to our click counter there, and then we're also going to have another text object, which we'll put in a sec here, which is the total time left, time remaining, like that. And inside of our update loop, for right now we'll just tie it to the spacebar, nothing too fancy. So we'll say if input dot get key down key code dot space, then we will say total clicks, actually total clicks plus plus. We don't have a total click, so I'll just start that off here. We will have an int total clicks 0, and then every time we hit the space bar, and it's a key down, not a get key, so it's every time the key is actually pressed, we'll get a total clicks plus plus, so it'll add it. Our time remaining text we haven't put into our scene yet, but we'll do it in a sec. And so what we need to do inside of our start, we're going to count down from like 10 seconds or something like that down to 0. So in time remaining equals 10, we'll start at 10. And then we'll have a 1 second timer. And I'm kind of going through this part a little quickly because we've talked about them before. But we're going to have an ID enumerator. It's kind of like a separate thread that runs back there. We'll just have an infinite, essentially an infinite loop in it. And the first line is we're going to wait for 1 second. And here we will say time remaining minus minus, and then we will say, so right here we will count our seconds down and update our text. So time remaining text equals dot text equals time plus time remaining. So this is just going to update. We'll have a little timer on the screen. I'll go add it in the GUI in a sec, but this is every second. It's just going to update how much time we have left. And then if time remaining is less than or equal to 0, our time's up. Let's end the game. And I'll make a new function, void endgame. And we'll put some stuff in there later. Let's see, click counter text. So also in this one we will have to say click counter text dot text equals clicks plus total clicks. So again, we're just trying to put something together really quickly so that we can have a game that gets scores that we can actually use. Oh, and then the other thing we forgot to do is inside of the start method, we need to start the coroutine. 1 second, like that. And that should be good. So if we go back to our wonderful game and hit play, nothing's going to happen. So let me unplay this thing, and I'm going to uncheck this maximize on play, just so that we can see all of our other stuff going on. So we have this game controller. It's got two text variables over here. One is the click counter text, which is this total clicks thing that we have, and I will drag that over here to link it up. And then we need a time remaining text, and so I'm just going to duplicate this with Control D or Command D, drag it over, and inside of here we'll say time, and we can just set it to 10. And then with that, we need to also update the reference in our game controller script for our time remaining, and now it should actually look okay. So our time is counting down. When we hit the space bar, we see that our clicks are going up, and let's see, time is done, we're still going, and so we need to do something a little bit different when we hit our endgame method. So what we'll do inside this endgame, the other thing we're going to do is break out of this, and endgame we will say, let's set a boolean that says our game's actually in play. So bool game in play equals true. And so when we end up in end game, we will say game in play equals false. And see, in our update loop, we just got to make sure that we actually are in play. If we're not, then we can just bail out right away. So if game in, not game in play, and we can just return. And now I think this will be much better. So once our time remaining gets less than or equal to 0, we call this endgame, which is going to set our game in play in false. So our update method will no longer take key presses. We are going to break out of this infinite while loop, so our timer should get to 0 and stay at 0. And that should be a much more entertaining game. Oops. And let's see, getting close to 0. There we go. So now I'm bashing on the space bar, and my clicks are not going up, and my time is down at 0. So that would be considered one round of our game. And what we're going to want to do is save off this high score. Let's say we want to have 5 high scores. And so with these 5 high scores, we'll just display them in the middle for now. And we need to check when we finish a game if the score deserves to be in that high score list. And if it does, we'll add it and save it off so that it's there for the next time. But what I'm going to do right now is just work on the display of these high scores. And this, again, is not going to be super fancy, but I'm just going to duplicate this one, drag it over, and we'll just kind of stick it in the middle here. And I'm going to rename this to high score, like that. And we're going to have 5 of these, so I'll just duplicate it 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, I'm not really making this very pretty, but and we're just going to have it in here. So this will be high score. I'll change the text that says high score, score 0. This will be high score 1, score 2, high score 3, and high score 4. And so if we look at our game view without actually pushing play, we see that now we have all of our space anyways for our high scores. And we've got the other stuff of our game still remaining up here. So what we need to do is a couple things. Once we finish a game, we need to figure out if our number of clicks that we got fits into this high score. And then we need to save it off somewhere on the hard drive or in the flash if you're on mobile, so that it's there when we come back. When we start the game over again, the high scores will all be there. And that's what we're going to do next. So I'm just going to make a new script, and we'll just call it Leaderboard. And I'm also going to put that onto our game controller. No reason to not put it there, I don't think. Okay, so inside of this, we need to do a couple things. We're going to have an array of text objects so that we can update our screen. So we need to do using UnityEngine.ui. And we'll have public text high scores. And since it's public, we're going to hook all this up inside of Unity itself. We'll drag in our high scores. Actually, we can do that now if we save it. And I go back to my scene display. Now, if I look at my game controller, I've got my leaderboard, and I have an array of high scores, which right now is set to 0. And I can populate that by just dragging them in. And so they're going to go in the order that you drag them in. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so now we have a reference to all of these different locations inside of our leaderboard script. So the way that we're going to store off these different scores is in something called player prefs. And that's available on all platforms, and it works out really good when you use it. And it's a good way to keep track of maybe any kind of settings that you have or any state in the game that maybe you want to keep around if you want to exit the app and come back to it. You want to keep it there, persist it over rebooting the computer, that sort of stuff. So that's a good place to put things. And so that's what we're going to use. And inside of player prefs, like you can just check it out. If you say player prefs dot set. So there's only 3 types of data that we can store inside, or I should say directly store in the player prefs. We can store ints, floats, and strings. We can't store arrays. We can't store classes. None of that sort of stuff directly. We'll talk more about how you can do that later, but just out of the box, these are the 3 types of variables that you can store. And so we're going to store our high scores as ints. So let's also have an array of high scores. Let's change this to high score text. How about high score values? There we go. So we'll have an array of high score values, and when we actually start running this class inside the start method, we're going to set this to the size of our high scores array. That way, if we add more to it, we'll be okay. You know, if all of a sudden the display supports 20, we can drag 20 in there, and all this stuff will still work. So high score values equals new int of high scores dot length. So this is just going to give us the same amount of space that we have on the screen to display to store these high score values. And then now let's load these things up. So we'll say for int x equals 0, x less than high scores dot length, x plus plus. And so we're going to load these things into an array. Even though we can't store them as an array, we're going to load them into an array. So what we have to do is we're going to store them in this case we have 5 high scores on the screen. We're going to store them in 5 separate variables in the player prefs, and then we'll load them into an array. So let me build this, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense when I actually put it in here. So we'll say high score values of x equals player prefs dot get int, because we're going to store all of our scores as ints, so not floats or anything. We're going to store them as ints. And when we say get in, it wants one thing, and that's what is this variable name, the key. What is it going to be? And in this case, we'll say high score values plus x. And what this is going to do is this thing is a whole string. So the first time when we're looking for high score values of x, it's going to look for the variable in player prefs called high score values 0, because it's going to concatenate these two strings. And then the second time through the loop, it's going to say high score values of 1 in the value, the int array, is going to equal high score values 1 that's stored in player prefs. So this kind of becomes high score values 0. And second time through the loop, it becomes a 1, and then a 2, then 3, then a 4. And so that's how these things are getting populated. And that's really all we have to do is that. And so after we get through this start method, these high score values are going to all be populated by what was stored on the device the last time we saved them. So let's actually write a save method. Void save scores, and it's going to be very similar to this. So we'll have the same for loop essentially. We're going to go through the length, but instead of doing a get int, we're going to do a set int. We give it the variable name, and then we pass it the value. So it's just basically doing the reverse of what we did up here. Instead of getting the values from player prefs and storing them into our high score values, we are setting the values in player prefs to what our high score values are. So that's the save score. So as long as the get and the set follow a similar naming convention, then you'll always be okay. Now we'll talk more later about better ways to do this. If you had like 1,000 ints or something like that, this may or may not be the preferred way of doing it, but there are other things that you can do in that case. But for small things like this is going to work out just fine. Okay, so we have a way of saving our scores. We have a way of getting them out of persistent storage. Now let's see. Let's draw them to the screen. Draw scores. And so we'll use a similar for loop, and we will just say that high score of x dot text equals high score values of x dot toString. So that'll pull these things from our memory of our current values and actually draw them to the screen. So if the first thing that I do inside of our start method after we initialize all this stuff is say draw scores like this, what should happen when we run? Well, the very first time that we run, there are no high scores in memory or on the disk. So all of these things are just going to return zeros because they don't exist. So when we call draw scores, we should see a bunch of zeros show up on the screen. And let's see if that is indeed the case. So I expect all of these to flip to a 0. And they did. So that's a good thing. Now what we need to do is to be able to save our total clicks when the game's over. We need to update our high score table if it needs to be in there. So we'll do that here. We'll just say check for public void check for high score int value. And so now when we get this value passed in at the end of the game, we will check it out against our high scores and then decide what we need to do as far as if that needs to be into our high score list or not, and then we'll save everything off at the end. So when this thing gets called, and we'll put that in the game controller, we have this fancy end game function here where we will call into our leaderboard and say, hey, we've got a new score, the game's over, is this thing a high score, and and save it. So so what we're going to do right here is let's check and see if this is actually a high score or not. So for int x equals 0, x less than high scores dot length x plus plus, and let's see. So we will say if value is greater than high scores of x, then we need to do something. So in this case, we're going to walk through all of our high scores that we've got saved. And we're going to double check and see if this new value is bigger than any of them. If it's not, then we're just going to fall through this loop here, and it's going to be no big deal. But if it is, if we end up in this if statement here, then we've got to do something with it. We've got to insert it into the list and then move everything down. So, so just if we had just to draw it out, if our high scores were 10, or how about 100, 50, 25, 10, and 5, and all of a sudden we come in with a 30, what has to happen is this becomes a 30, the other ones shift down, and then we're going to remove that 5 because we're only going to have 5 total. So we've got to stick it where it needs to go and then shift everything else down. That's what our little algorithm is going to need to do. So, so let's do that. And so we will say if it is bigger, then that value has to move down and everything below that has to move down. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start at the bottom and work our way back. So and the reason we're doing that is because we need to keep track of what all these scores are. So if we've found a spot where this thing is going to go, then we're going to first shift everything down and then put this in the right spot. So we'll have another for loop, int y equals 0. Actually, so we're going to start at the very end, so high scores dot length minus 1, y is greater than x, y minus minus. Okay, so we're going to start at the bottom of our list. Actually, let me put this back. So we had something like this where we had 100, 50, 25, 10, 5. And so what we want to do is when we decide that we want to insert, let's say if we want to insert a 30, so we want this 25 to go here and we want this 10 to go down to 5. And so what we've done is we've gone through this first for loop. This part right here has told us that first we check and see, is our value greater than 100? No. Is it greater than 50? No. Is it greater than 25? Yes, it is. And so what we need to do is we go all the way down to this position, and we don't care what happens with this 5 because it's just going to go away. So the first step is to move this 10, copy this 10 down into where this 5 is. Then we copy this 25 to where this 10 is, and then we put the 30 in where the 25 is. That's how the algorithm is going to work. So let's see if that actually does work out that way. Move this up. So here we go. So we're going to say at this point we want to change what our high scores are. So high scores of y equals high scores of what? Y minus 1. That's all we're doing. High scores of y, which we start here, is equal to the one before it. And then is equal to the one before it, and then we're going to be done. So that's all we need to do. Once we're finished with our for loop, we can do something like high scores of x equals value, and then we're done. Break out of all of our loops. All right. And that should be all that we need to do to update our high scores. Oh, what else do we got to do? We got to save it. So we will draw scores, and then we will save scores. And I think that's probably it. So we still haven't called this function yet. We'll do that from our game controller class. But when we do call it, we're going to go through these two for loops. First, we're going to make sure that it is a valid high score. Then we're going to move everything down by 1. And then put it into the right spot, draw our scores to the screen, and save them. And I think that's all that we really need to do. So let's take a look at our game controller code. So down here, somehow we need to access this leaderboard script and call this check for high score method. And the easy way to do that is we will just say get component leaderboard dot check for high score. And the high score that we're passing in is our total clicks. Just like that. The reason we can do a get component just like this is because the leaderboard and the game controller are all on the same object. If the leaderboard was on a different object in the scene, then we would have to first get a reference to that object and then do a get component. But since they're on the same object, we can get away with doing it just like this. All right, let's see, is this going to work? Nope. So this should be our high scores array is our text that's actually on the screen. This should be high score values. High score values. Small typo. High score values. And with that, it should be much happier. It is. All right, so let's see what happens. As soon as we start to run, our timer starts going, our clicks are going up, our high scores are all zeros, which is okay. And let's see what happens when time runs out. Our 31 clicks goes right to the top of the list. So now if I unplay it and play this thing again, it's going to remember that we had 31 that last time. So now let's see if we can get more than 31 in these 10 seconds and see. There we go. So there's 35. All right, let's just keep going. 42. So 42 went to the top of the list. That works pretty good. We should check all of our edge cases here. So now let's do one that's less than 31. Let's just do about a 16. And hopefully this will go at the end and not at the beginning. So far we've only seen it add stuff at the top. There you go, that's good. So now let's do one in the middle. Let's try and get something between 31 and 16, like how about 25? And that should put it right in the right spot. And yes, it did. And let's do one more Doesn't matter where this one is because I think we've tested all of our scenarios. And we should have a full leaderboard at that point, which we do. And let's do one more to make sure that once we have a full leaderboard that everything still works and it can find a place to put stuff and it doesn't break. So where does that go? There we go. And so these are our top scores. Now it isn't really being displayed that nicely, but they're all there. They're sorted, and it gives something for the player to shoot for. Now the other thing you could do is you could actually have the player enter some initials so that his name is tied to these high scores as well. So you can have it the way it is right now, where somebody playing the game knows that they need to get a certain score to get on the leaderboard. But you could also make some improvements so that the player could enter initials or something like that. So that would be an upgrade to what we currently have. Okay, so we're going to add the, we'll prompt the player for his initials if he hits a high score. And let's see how we're going to do that. What we're going to need is a text input box. And let's see if I can just put that in here. So inside of our canvas, I'll just say UI input field. Let me drag it down here. And we'll stick it here for now. And then we'll also have a, let's see, button to submit our high score name. So, in real life, you're going to have to make this slightly more robust, but that's okay. So what we'll do is, let's see, when this button gets pressed, we will then take whatever text is in this field here and then use that to update all of our high scores. So let's get back to our code. There we go. Then we'll come down here, and then so when we say check for high score, we'll also pass in string username, something like this. And over here in the game controller, we are not going to do this here, but we will do it in a public void initials entered, like this. And we will, not only are we going to pass in the total clicks, but we're going to pass in the player's name. So we will need a public input field player name. So we will need that, and then we will pass total clicks, comma, player name dot text, like this. So again, this isn't going to be super robust. You might want to put this in a different scene of just entering initials, or anywhere else. But for right now, we're just going to stick it in here, and we'll play by the rules and not try to hit all the edge cases, just so you can see how this is going to work. All right. And so now we're also going to, when we come in here and say check for high score, we're going to need to save off this username as well. So what we had originally is this pair of high scores and high score values, but now let's do a string high score names, something like this. And so when we come out of here and we say we're going to get our int of our high score values, the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to get our high score names. So high score names of x equals high score names plus x. Right? So, and this is going to be a get string, which will be our player's name. And again, it's the same thing. We're adding an x because we're going to have 5 different high score names stored in player preferences or player prefs. And when we're done with this thing, we'll find a better way to do this, or we'll talk about a better way to do it. But for right now, this is going to work, and it illustrates the point. When we draw our scores, actually let's go to save scores. And again, I just copy and pasted, and instead of set int, we will set string, and it's going to be high score names plus x, and this is going to be high score names of x. And if we come down here to this, we will have to do the same thing, high score names of y equals high score names of y minus 1. All the same stuff. Because we can't store a class directly in a player prefs, we have to do this kind of Mickey Mouse thing of storing our names and our values separately. And so anytime we're updating our names array, we're going to have to also update our scores array. So that's what's going on here. High score names of x equals, this is user name. When we draw scores, our high scores of text is going to equal high score names of x plus, we'll just do like a colon, something like that. And I think that should do it. So, basically what we did is we just copy and pasted everything dealing with values, but named it names, so that these things get stored in there. And let's see, then inside of our game controller, we're not directly updating our high score list at the end of the game. We're going to do it when the initials are entered. And so yeah, in theory it's possible to hit this button at any time, but that's not really what we're worried about right now. If I go back to Unity, let's see, what is this complaining about? String high score names. Oh, good thing that got caught. So we also need to set the size of this high score names array. So just like we did this with high score values, we will do it also with high score names. And that's going to be a new string. That. And now it should be much happier. There we go. Okay, so another piece that we have to do is when this button is clicked, we have to call the correct function. And so if you haven't done much with buttons at all, you can come over here and look at this on click. So I've got our button selected, and over here, let's change the text on this button. Let's just call it submit. How's that? On this, the inspector for the button, we've got over here, this is going to be a list of functions I can get called when that button's pressed. And right now it's empty, so if I hit plus, it's going to allow me to choose which object to call a function on. I click on that. I clicked on this little circle thing right here. And it pops up this window of who do we want to call. It's going to be the game controller. And then now over here, these are our functions inside of game controller. And I think we called it initials entered. There we go. And so now when I click on this button, that function is going to get called. And inside of our game controller class, when you call initials entered, then we go check for high score with total clicks and our player name.text. All of that should work. But let's see what happens. So right now, we have, these are all empty because we didn't do, oops, let me get it. Let's see if I can get it. I couldn't get it fast enough. So these names are all empty right now because we didn't save them inside of player pref. So as soon as I get a high score, we should be able to see a name in there. Okay, so in theory, if I type in my name or somebody else's name and hit submit, ooh, what happened? So it complained. It seemed like things were working, but then all of a sudden when I hit submit, it blew up. And it blew up on this line saying it has no idea what a player name is. And the reason is that inside of our game controller, we have this player name field. And we never linked it up. So what I need to do is just grab this input field and drag it over there. And things will be much happier. All right, let's give this another shot. Make sure that I get on the leaderboard. And And there we go. And now it updated. Fred with 57 is at the top of the leaderboard. And if I unplay and play it again, he's going to show up. We can try to get a bunch of more clicks in here and see if we can add somebody else's name to this list. 56, we can say that that was Larry, submit it, and now we've got Larry starting to get names in here with values associated with them. And you can jazz this up a little bit and say, this is a leaderboard or something like that. Put that up there. So that's how you do this sort of leaderboard stuff. Now it is already getting messy with just having 2 parameters because inside of our leaderboard class, we've always got to have these pairs of value arrays and name arrays. We could make a class that stores all of them. Probably that would be the ideal way to do it. If you had a class that had names and values. That way it's all stored in one spot, but you still, the way it's structured right now, you still would have to do these 2 separate gets and sets, just like we had right here, because we can only store primitives, well, essentially primitives, floats, ints, and strings inside of our player prefs. So another thing that you can do, though, is you can take, so if we were, and I'm not going to do it right now because we don't need to, but if we did make a class that was all of our information for the leaderboard, which could be our name, the high score, something else about the name like UID or something that we look up in a database table, anything like that, we could store all that into a class. And then when we go to write it to our player prefs, if we had 8 different parameters inside of our class, we would have to write 8 different variables into 8 separate arrays. And that gets really messy. So one thing that you could do is you could convert your object, your class, to a string, like a JSON string, and just store it as a string. And that's actually the better way to do it. So you could store your object as a string, and then when you come back, read it in and convert it back to an object. And that's probably the preferred way to do some of these things. But if all you're trying to do is get a simple leaderboard in your game like this one, then it's perfectly okay to keep track of these 2 different arrays, or at least use the primitive data types that we have inside of the player prefs class to store these things. So anyways, that is a quick tutorial on how to do a leaderboard.